there, Jim, and I guess the business of password cracking is getting big.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Came across this article tail end of last week in Ars Technica, and I've talked on the program a number of times about passwords and password cracking, and one of the tools that good guys use, the bad guys probably use it too, is Hashcat. That's just one of the tools that's been out for a while now for cracking passwords. And this article pointed out that a new version of OCL Hashcat Plus, which is a version of Hashcat that takes advantage of GPUs, graphics processors, graphics cards, and it can potentially harvest the power of a lot of them. It had a limitation until last week that it could only crack passwords up to 15 characters, and with folks tending to start using bigger passwords, longer in passphrases, one of the features that the developers had been asked for numerous times was to increase the length of the passwords that could be cracked with OCL Hashcat Plus. There are a couple of other versions of Hashcat that could do longer passwords already, but this one that basically was the most powerful one because it could take advantage of the GPUs, could only handle up to 15. They have since upped that to about 55 characters now. Part of the problem was, and part of the reason why they hesitated in putting this feature in so long, was that they had done some nice optimizations that had sped up the calculations in the old version, and by increasing the length of the hashes that they were, or the passwords that they were able to crack, they had to remove some of these optimizations. They said that typically this cost them about 15%, but they've made some of that up by doing optimizations in other places, sorting the dictionaries by length and so forth. So now this really powerful tool can crack passwords up to about 55 characters in length. Another thing that they added was the ability to prune the lists based on password policies. For example, if you know you're trying to crack passwords in a Microsoft domain where there's a password policy, in effect, you can actually now apply these policies to prune the dictionaries that they use for doing the attacks. So that that also sped some things up.
I was looking at this article, and it was interesting that they had this really obscure and strange and unusual password that they were able to crack. I don't see if it actually identifies the time that it was cracked in, but it was interesting that it was crackable partly because it showed up in a Wikipedia article, and it reminds me of the, Watson, the one that participated in the game Jeopardy, and was basically, a big library of a whole bunch of things that were pilfered off the internet, and using that as a means to help answer questions. So, I don't know, have you looked into that aspect of this at all, Jim?
Yeah, well, that's one of the ways that folks tend to build up their word lists and their dictionaries is, by scraping things like Wikipedia and others to build up their lists of phrases. And actually, in some of the comments on the article, they talk about the fact that folks. One of the suggestions is use the first letter of each word from some phrase or song or something. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was pointed out in here in the comments, not in the article itself, is that if those lyrics to a song or phrases from a book are on the internet someplace, that they can be scraped from there and apply this technique of taking the first letter from each word. And so those passwords are actually even potentially guessable, depending on how you build up your word lists before you start trying to crack it.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I should point out, this article is talking about a tool that cracks password hashes when offline. So the bad guys have managed to break into a database someplace and steal password hashes, and then they can go off and crack them at their leisure someplace else. This is not folks doing brute forcing, trying to guess passwords directly on a website someplace. We've talked a number of times that you can slow down those kinds of attacks, but that's not what this particular tool is for. This tool is for a case where the bad guys have managed to grab the password hashes, and now they're off on their own trying to crack them.
Right. Good point, Jim. And I guess to make sure that point isn't belittled in any way here, a common technique is to compromise some sort of machine, go in and grab the password hashes off of that machine. That would include administrator accounts associated with that machine, crack those passwords, and then use that to be able to perhaps move laterally around an enterprise and do it relatively quickly. So this sort of attack is one that gets used in a very nefarious way to be able to escalate privileges at the very least.
Big password breaches over the last few years have all been these kinds of things where all of the hashes were exposed somehow, and they were offline and cracked, and some of them did a better job than others of encrypting them beforehand, but that's what all of the big password breaches of the last few years, or nearly all of the big password breaches of the last few years, have been this kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Reminds me of something that happened to me a while back. One major database that was breached was for rootkit.com. That's a website where security researchers can go and find out more about rootkit techniques and advanced programming. And that database was breached. I had an account from when I was still at the university, and somebody emailed me with my password and said, if this is your password, you should change it, and if you use this password anywhere else, you should change it as well. So, something that I had registered with a really long time ago, and it was suddenly disclosed, and then the password was cracked offline and sent back to me, basically. If I had reused that password anywhere else, then, those other places would be in trouble, including, any jobs where I had worked since the university. If I had ever used that password, that they would definitely be, under risk, at least. Luckily, I had the foresight back then to realize that registering with a website full of, security researchers, it's probably good to use a password